Hello and welcome to Socialism, the podcast of the Socialist Party. Hit subscribe to never miss an episode. I'm Oscar Parry, a Socialist Party member, and today's podcast is a discussion with Sarah Sachs-Eldridge, national organizer of the Socialist Party, on fighting for LGBTQ plus rights in 2025. While it was never true that LGBTQ plus liberation was an inevitability within the system of profit before wealth capitalism, the basis for that hope has suffered major blows in the last year. The pace of attacks can feel overwhelming. Donald Trump's second term has begun with cruel attacks on LGBTQ plus rights in the US on a much bigger scale than in his first term. And in the UK, the recent Supreme Court ruling on the legal definition of a woman and the Cath review shows again how tenuous minority legal rights are in a system based on the exploitation of the majority by a small elite who ultimately can only maintain their rule through the methods of divide and rule. So how can we fight for LGBTQ plus liberation in the teeth of these attacks? Hi Sarah, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So in many ways, this year's Pride Month feels quite different, doesn't it?
It really does, doesn't it? Well, Trump's in the White House. That's a big factor in it. And he began his second term with vicious attacks on LGBTQ rights in the US, really on a much bigger scale than we saw in Trump's first term. For example, some of them are really just cruel. The federal government has confirmed that it intends to cut funding for a suicide and crisis lifeline specialist service for LGBT young people. And just to put that in context, about 1.3 million young people have used it since it was set up under Trump's first term. So kind of showing how much he's gone in this term to really turn to an attack on LGBTQ plus issues. And that's a double whammy because he's cut that service, and at the same time, all the other things that he's doing is creating greater need for people to use that service. So it's a really horrible situation for LGBTQ plus Americans. He's signed, we've seen multiple executive orders in his first 3 months that impact the lives of LGBTQ plus Americans in terms of healthcare, legal recognitions and protection from discrimination. So I think, we can, what we're seeing is a turning point in the fight for LGBTQ plus rights.
So how is this turning point manifesting itself?
Well, in lots of ways, but one of them is that, the changed approach in the White House is washing away some of the rainbows that we've seen at the top of society, that is. Many big corporations are abandoning their claims to be LGBT allies. They're reducing or dropping diversity and inclusivity policies. They're dropping or reducing their sponsorship of Pride events, and they're pulling away, from things like featuring LGBTQ plus couples in advertising. We've seen what that looks like. Liverpool Pride in Britain this year has cancelled after organisers couldn't secure sponsorship in the way that they've been able to do previously. And, in many ways, this is not a shock at all. Banks and corporations, we know, have their own interests. They were happy to use LGBT rights to further those interests when there was a climate that facilitated that. But now that's changing and they're abandoning ship. And as socialists, we've always warned that because they prioritise profit, big business could not be relied on to take the struggle for our rights forward, especially when it's needed. And now it's really, really needed. And I think what we're seeing, is being in some ways like dramatically revealed in this process, is that it was never true that LGBTQ plus liberation was an inevitability, which some people claimed or sort of operated in that way. It was never an inevitability within a system of profit before all else capitalism. But in the last year, the hopes that that was a possibility have been really smashed. And what we're seeing is that gains that have been won through struggle and that, you know, people will have seen as permanent gains are actually now coming under threat. And the Trump symbolizes the new situation, and his approach is sort of setting the tone, giving cover to some of those attacks as well. And that's why it's really vital that as part of this year's Pride Month, but beyond, not just for the month, that we're discussing what's going on, that we're looking back at all those struggles that have won and the ones that haven't won, and trying to learn all of the lessons of that and working out the most effective way to fight for LGBTQ plus liberation, and I would say as part of the fight for socialism today. So
Trump's second term is a disaster for LGBT rights?
Sure is. But I think it's important as well that, like, while we're talking about Trump, that we're not in any way given the impression that this is just down to how awful he is. He's awful, but he didn't invent homophobia. He didn't invent attacks on migrants. He didn't attempt, measures to get the billionaires more billions. But I think in that way, we should recognise that there's no coincidence about that attacks on LGBT rights often have happened at the same time as governments are making attacks on living standards more broadly, and face opposition then. And that means that they, know that they will face a challenge and are whipping up division. Trump's turned up the volume on this, really to the max, and he's creating misery, but he's only doing what he's learned from his capitalist forebears, which is an established practice really for the capitalist class, the defenders of that profit before all else system. And, just to go back a few years, in the period after the Second World War, for example, in that process, the working class grew massively in the US. Millions moved from the countryside into the cities. Confidence of LGBT workers grew a lot in that process, but also just the general confidence of the working class to stand up against oppression, yes, but also the exploitation, that the working class faces in capitalism. And in response to that, one of the things that the government did was to launch what became called a lavender scare, whipping up the fear that LGBT workers were a threat to America, the dream and so on. And it included banning lesbian and gay workers from federal posts. An estimated, I've read, 5,000 to 10,000 workers were actually either, put through trials and sacked, or resigned out of fear of what they would go through if they tried to defend themselves. And that was, very clearly an attempt to divide and weaken the working class, undermine its confidence to act collectively for the unity of the working class to be, attacked at that time. And you could give loads of examples going back through history, but I know we've got other things to get onto today. But yeah, what I'm trying to say is that seeking division among the working class has always been part of that capitalist playbook.
So we've talked a lot about the situation in the US, but there's also been attacks on LGBT rights in Britain as well.
Yeah, that is a good point. Because, here we're also seeing a government that has got nothing on offer but attacks on the working class. That's what we've seen in the last week, the time that we're recording this podcast, of the attacks, the vicious attacks on disability benefits. The anger at which is being reflected to a certain extent through the rebel MPs. So Starmer's government is actually, even though elected with a landslide, is actually very weak. And only about 1 in 5 eligible voters backed Labour in the general election. That was the lowest share for any incoming government since 1918. And they've only become less popular since. They promised change. Starmer, Reeves, that was the word that we kept on hearing. But the problem that they face is that they're trying to defend capitalism in a system where capitalism in general is in crisis, and British capitalism is extremely weak. economic growth in Britain is extremely poor, and they have no solutions to turn that around. That's one of the reasons, actually, that Starmer is so desperate to cozy up to Trump, inviting him to come and visit the king and so on, in the hope that Britain might be spared some of the tariff pain that Trump is dealing out. And what, some of the things that underlie that, we don't have time to go into everything, but for example, the bosses prefer to squeeze profit out of workers instead of investing in technology and training and so on. Privatisation has gone very far in Britain, further than a lot of other countries. And that, as we know, is a massive transfer of wealth from to the richest. Just to give one example, because the NHS is one of the areas where people are invited to think about LGBT rights, trans rights, and so on. But just to give one figure to frame that discussion, it's estimated that the proportion of the NHS budget spent on private providers is at least 18%, about £36 billion. And those private companies, as a result, their profits go up, and we get a funding and a staffing crisis, and huge waiting lists for vital services. And that's a figure that we've got to keep in our heads when we're told that the problem with the health service is young people seeking gender-affirming care. Some of the biggest waiting lists are in that area of health. And we should say no one should be on a waiting list for important treatments and so on, especially as the fact that we live in the 6th richest country on the planet. But what we're seeing is the rich are getting richer and the rest of us are suffering.
So how does this link in with LGBTQ plus rights? Yeah,
good point. It's not just off on a tangent. And the thing is that Labour, because it's defending, across the board, the wealth of the corporations, the interests of big business, that means that they're compelled to attack the working class, like those benefit attacks, cutting our services, holding pay down or giving pay awards to education workers but not increasing the funding, or giving the means to sort of set service users against workers, scapegoating the most vulnerable in society like the PIP claimants and so on, and condemning kids, with the 2-child benefit cap to cold, to hunger, etc., etc. We could just go on. But like I said, because they are compelled to make these attacks, that means that they're also, to an extent, have to recognise that they will face opposition, that they will face workers and young people unwilling to accept that all we can look forward to is falling living standards. And they're right about that. We predict that as well. But they, their response to that prediction is to attack democratic rights, like the right to protest. Under Starmer's Labour, we've seen more, I would say, more police on some of the Gaza demos that even we saw under the Tories. In Leicester, you've got a Labour council there carrying out these attacks on public services, on council services, and they've introduced a ban on campaigners from setting up stalls in the city centre to be able to campaign against those things. Actually, I think it's no accident, by the way, that the first fine that they've issued was against a Socialist Party member campaigning against those cuts being made by the Labour Council. And the predictions of resistance to their austerity means that we'll also see, as well as attacks on our right to protest and to organise, they come at it from the other angle as well, which is attempts to divide us in order to weaken our ability to build a powerful, united struggle against austerity and capitalism. And that makes it really important that we link the need to fight the oppression that is faced by sections of society, like LGBTQ plus people, like migrants, like women, a big section of society, that we link all of those struggles with the need to fight all the cuts, all the austerity, all the attacks on living standards, that we are all part of the same struggle in that way. yeah, so one of the things that we've seen in Britain is the Supreme Court ruling on trans rights and on the legal definition of a woman, and that shows that we can't rely on legal rights, but also that how tenuous really minority rights are in a system that is based on the exploitation of the majority by a small elite. They want to hold on to their position, so our rights, are not permanent in that situation.
So that's where these renewed culture wars fit in.
Exactly. That elite can, ultimately only maintain their power through, like I said, those methods of divide and rule, weakening our class's ability to defend our interests. And, like I said about Trump, when it comes to doing that, it's not their first rodeo. Culture wars are tried and tested means to divide us. What they do basically is make appeals to workers to identify with, sections of the elite against other sections of our class. The idea that we have a shared culture or community against others. We're often asked, aren't we, to identify in the national interest, do this, do that, take the cuts to our public services and the national interest. We all have a national interest in getting the economy going, but we just have to cut these benefits and just have to cut these services. But inevitably, it's the rich that get richer out of that, and the rest of us suffer. We don't have the same interests as the bosses for obvious reasons, but they do everything that they can to cover up and hide that. And like you said, the appeal to a shared culture with our exploiters is one of those means. And they will then pose the others, as a shared threat, or to this collective so-called culture or community, and that's how it's posed. And who they identify as the others, does vary across time and geography, but normally, they use to identify it the different races, ethnicities, religions, and so they've included, particularly recently, migrants, LGBTQ plus people. And there are many examples that we could point to, even in the last few months. Starmer's white paper on immigration, that was a classic, really, wasn't it? But in Britain, we had the Tories really set it up, this appeal to fear that trans women are a threat to women's services, women's rights, women's safety, and Labour's, continued that, picking on the tiny trans population in Britain. And in 2021, that was the last census in England and Wales, and it found 0.5% of the population, about 262,000 people identified as a gender different from their sex assigned at birth. So that's what Labour is using to try and distract the anger that exists in society on these issues. So we've got to point out that's a lie, obviously. But also just have a little think about what are the tools that they have to whip up any appeal to those lies. And they've got lots of tools, actually. And I think it's important that we have a think about that. Educational institutions, the court system, the Supreme Court sits at the top of that, Parliament, religious institutions, and the big business-owned media as well, none of which, the working class has control over at this stage. And it goes back a long way. The first homophobic laws in Britain were introduced by Henry VIII, and that was part of his struggle for control over wealth and power in society. With regards to the capitalist press, there's research done by the Press Standards Organisation that showed that there'd been a 400% increase in news stories about transgender issues between 2009 and 2019. And they were, increasingly hostile. So you can see that role. But the capitalist class also has other advantages when it comes to bolstering claims of cross-class shared culture and community. And, one of them is just the fact that they've been doing this for a long time. They have invested over centuries into, for example, the ideas of nationalism. Those ideas have been constructed, adapted since the capitalist system were founded, and are deeply rooted and are used when they're making an appeal for us to, when they want to whip up racism, basically.
And the same goes for fear-mongering against LGBTQ plus people.
Yeah, I mean, homophobia has got different roots to the roots of racism. But yes, when it comes to homophobia, the capitalist class can appeal to the gender norms that they've invested in and established over a long time. In fact, previous class societies as well. Those gender norms are ultimately linked to the social and economic role of the family under capitalism. And, there's obviously been big gains, things that have been fought for under attack, like all our gains, but working class has fought for nurseries, health services, social care, etc., etc. But you can see that when it comes to the family, that the gendered unpaid labour, as we call it, of caring in the family, remains a fallback position, and that's the role it plays. So just to give a statistic, it was worked out that in 2014, women carried out 60% of unpaid work in the home in Britain, and that its value was just over £1 trillion. So you can see these gender norms, this not the role of the family as many of us get to enjoy it or not, but this role of the family in the, inside capitalism is really valuable to the capitalist class, because that's money that they don't have to then invest in those services. We've got to fight for that, obviously. So as well as saving billions in care and other services, the gender stereotypes are also used in other ways, aren't they? We see it all the time in advertising, in the leisure industry, pharmaceutical industry, making billions of pounds for people in the porn industry, you could argue as well. And then the kind of kicker is that you have an appeal to protect the family from anyone who dares to transgress the sort of idea of a nuclear family, from the very people who are making it much harder to have a decent family life, who are destroying and denying public services, making families more impoverished and therefore more stressed. Housing, such a huge issue in family stress, and especially women, taking up the slack of all those cuts and privatizations. And all of that is coming from the people who say, no, the family must come first, and all of that.
So are there other advantages that the capitalist class has in maintaining its rule?
Well, yes, there are. And one of them, I think that we have to say this, is that where, throughout, the history of class struggle, really, where there's been leaders of our class, either in the trade unions or in political parties, that have failed to make the link between the struggles we all face and the whipping up of division, so i.e. the struggles against oppression of groups, or against war, against racism, against homophobia, the struggle for women's liberation and so on, where those are not all linked together, that actually is an advantage that they have as well, because if the logic then of that is that I suppose, and connected to that really, is that those leaders have not recognised that it's all part and parcel of the struggle against capitalism. And if you accept, you might say, yeah, we have to fight for more pay, or we have to fight for this. But if you accept doing that within the framework of existing capitalism, the logic really is that there's a fixed slice of the national cake that's available to the working class, and then one gain by one section of the working class has got to be paid for by sacrifice of another section of the working class. And that's a disaster, really. That is an absolute, that's what leads to the acceptance of the idea that there's irreconcilable conflicts of interest, for example, between trans women and other women. And that, really is, a disaster for the working class. Now, we do have those, unfortunately, those ideas, represented by some of the right-wing trade union leaders today. And you might say, well, the Socialist Party is always going on about terms of the trade unions, the importance of the trade unions, and that's absolutely right. The trade unions are absolutely key mass organisations through which the working class can organise, can act collectively, can fight for its interests, fight for better pay, fight against attacks on all sections of the working class. But that can be undermined if the leaderships are not giving the right political direction, really. And that's where the trade unions, you can say, could sort of play a dual role, that they can also be organisations through which the authority of those right-wing trade union leaders who haven't recognised the need for a socialist alternative to capitalism can sort of get authority in those unions, and that can undermine the collective programme, undermine the ability of the unions to play a role in cohering and developing the confidence of our class, and can give credence to those culture war ideas as well. And that's why the struggle for LGBTQ plus rights and the struggle for trade unions to have a socialist fight back approach and a socialist leadership are all one and the same, and also for the trade unions to be fighting for the building of a new workers' party with a socialist programme that can unite all of us as well.
So how do the more recent events in the UK, and specifically the Supreme Court ruling and the Cath review, fit into this?
Yeah, good. I'm glad you brought me back to those important points, because we do need to look at that. As I said, the Supreme Court ruling found that a person with a gender recognition certificate in the female gender does not come within the definition of a woman for the purpose of sex discrimination under the Equality Act. And this case was brought by an organisation called For Women Scotland, who claims that it aims to protect and strengthen women and children's rights. But let's be absolutely clear. There is nothing in this ruling, nor any future attacks on trans rights, that is going to improve the situation for women in Britain today. In austerity Britain, women are under attack, and the Labour government, which has backed this ruling, has shown time and again it has got nothing about it that's on the side of working class women. Women workers are at the sharp end of all of the attacks of low pay. Women rely on public services as primary carers. Women pensioners are disproportionately poor, and so things like the winter fuel payment, was a greater attack on women. We've had the WASPy women denied justice, and so on and so forth. So it's utter hypocrisy for Labour to claim that it is acting in the interests of women. Again, it's an attempt to rip up division, anti-trans division. And
this all fits into the broader culture wars.
Yeah, exactly. With all culture war appeals, the invitation to feel fear, to identify a group of workers that you're opposed to, has got an appeal. They've got a basis to make that appeal. It's a wrong basis, but the appeal that it's an invitation to feel that fear on the basis of experience of capitalist society, where male violence against women remains deeply ingrained, notwithstanding all the improvements that have been made in recent decades. And capitalist politicians point to trans women as the main threat, as the vehicle for that danger, within the very public services whose funding they've cut and privatised. And I think what's significant about that is they barely mention trans men, non-binary people, even though that's how a majority of young people identify today. And the reality is that the things that they're claiming to protect, like everything else, it's a lie. Single-sex spaces are not safe in a society where violence against women is tolerated.
So single-sex spaces is one of the main arguments they're trying to use. Could you back that up with some statistics?
Yeah, definitely. So it's not so much a single-sex space, but it's, the idea that women are protected in society. In 2023, following on from Sarah Everard and so on, there was 548 police officers being investigated for sexual misconduct and domestic abuse claims. And of those, 347 were working as normal and 236 were placed on restricted duties. Other figures, a staggering 97% of young women in the UK have experienced sexual harassment. So society is not a safe space for women in that way. The view of women as objects, as second-class citizens, that all contributes to that, and that is reinforced by those things that we were talking about earlier, the sexist objectification of women in advertising and other profit-seeking industries, and also reinforced by, if women are lower paid in the workplace, it kind of reinforces the idea that of a second place in society. And we can go further than that because, we were talking about the family earlier, but for many women, sadly, horribly, even their home is not a safe space. 2 women a week are killed by a violent partner or an ex-partner. And, we've had a lot of talk about domestic violence refuges in the course of this discussion about trans rights and so on. But let's be absolutely clear. Tory local government funding cuts and their commissioning practices, which were unchallenged throughout the whole period of Tory government by Labour councils, meant that, this is the latest figures I could find, in 2022-23, more than 10,000 women escaping domestic violence were refused safe housing. And the single biggest threat to women's safety in relation to refuges is the fact that they've been closed. 1 in 6 refuges was closed between 2010 and 2017. And that did not have to happen. The Tories said there was no money, but Labour councils could have refused to make those cuts. They could have refused to make any cuts and mounted a campaign to fight for the funding for the public services that we needed, the youth services that we needed, as well as the refuges that we needed, as well as all the other services that we needed and that they cut and closed under the Tories. And actually, what we're seeing this week in relation to the U-turn by the Labour government shows that pressure could have been effective. The second biggest threat, effective actually in fighting for national funding for council services. Instead, what we've got is a council funding crisis. The second biggest threat to those refuge services is, to women in those scenarios, is being forced back into the violent situation because there's not enough, Not
enough council houses?
Yeah, not enough council houses, exactly. So expanding and improving provision has got to be linked to the fight for council homes. It's got to be linked to the fight for all the other services that we need, and none of that is on offer from Starmer and Reeves. That struggle has got to be built.
So how do we fight back against all these attacks?
Well, the working class has got to defend all the gains that we've made, including the gains that we've made that have come under attack in the Supreme Court ruling that we have equality in our workplaces, in our public services, in our facilities. And we have to accept that ending discrimination in society is not going to be done by a law or a court within a system that relies on the division that we've talked about to maintain its situation. We can only win in the courts. And this is something that we will learn time and time again. We can only win in the courts. Like the Glasgow home care workers in 2018 could only win in the courts what they'd won in the workplaces through strike action, through solidarity action, through collective organising. And I'd say as well, it tells us that we have to defend those services, we have to fight for them, and we also have to fight to have a say in how they're run. That we need services, especially, for example, those supporting victims of domestic violence, to be run safely. That means adequate screening processes. That means adequate staffing, by the way, doesn't it? That means not having staff who spend their time trying to secure the charity funding for the next year, but proper council funding. So that means a struggle, doesn't it? It means not just staff, but properly and specially trained staff who've got the specialisation to meet the different needs of the different sections of the people needing those services. And that means that we've got to have that can't be fought for by one section of the working class alone. That's got to be part of our general programme, the working class fighting for it and countering the division in the workplace and in society. And we can't leave safety in any part of society to the bosses. I mean, just look at the pumping of pollutants into our waterways that shows that, for example. And the trade unions are the best place organisation to organise that safe workplaces, safe public services, safe facilities through a member's role in the workplace, in those places, and to resist the division that the bosses might try and use the Supreme Court ruling to open up is going to be part of that struggle. If they can, split us, our ability to determine how things are run, that things are not closed, that things are not privatised, is much weaker. So in essence, I suppose, in some ways, the facing up to what the Supreme Court ruling means that the workers' movement has got to discuss the question of fighting for democratic workers' control in the workplaces.
Definitely.
Which is something that has happened, been a part of the labour movement before, but has got to be brought back again.
And how does the Cath review fit into this picture?
Yeah, there's a lot going on, isn't there? So Starmer, as we've saw, presented the Supreme Court ruling as, something that happened, was issued, basically, that he and the Labour government had no choice but to accept. I mean, they welcomed it, but they didn't give the impression that they could choose whether to accept it or not. But that's rubbish, because governments, of course, have a choice over what they do, including which classes' interests they represent. And this ruling is ultimately in the interest of the capitalist class. And the same goes for the Cath review. The publication by NHS England of Dr. Hilary Cass's independent review of gender identity services for children and young people, really, I think we have to say it has been used as cover, scientific cover, by various capitalist politicians, including Starmer in Britain, but also internationally. It's been used by some of the state governments in the US they're using it as cover to continue the attacks on trans rights that they were already making. It hasn't made them do it. They had already chosen to go down that road for all of the reasons that we've covered here today. An academic review or NHS England, they don't have power in Britain to compel the government to do anything, really. They don't have the power to compel Wes Streeting to ban puberty blockers, but he's done that. They don't have the power to compel him to close clinics, but he's done that. That is part of him being a pro-privatisation health secretary, isn't it? And actually, this has not been widely covered, I would say, in a lot of the discussion about what the Cath review actually says. But it doesn't call for a ban on puberty blockers. It calls for puberty blockers to be only prescribed within a research protocol, and Streeting has chosen to ignore that. But let's be clear on this as well, actually. Scientific research is also never class neutral, and it's not an end in itself. Even research that found fully in favour of the widespread provision of puberty blockers or any treatment, I would say, wouldn't replace the need for democratic working class control and oversight of medical research and usage, because we want everyone to be safe as well as to have access to the treatments that they need. Genuine safety in healthcare, I would say, must include full public funding of the NHS, so eliminating those waiting lists, for example, democratic working class control and management as well of those health services, and also really key, I think, is the nationalisation of the pharmaceutical industry. Because how can we trust those people who are prioritising profit when they're producing medicines to have our health interests at heart? We absolutely can't. And that's got to be part of the fight for a socialist NHS, not just an austerity-free, privatisation-free, but a socialist NHS that would really be organised at providing everybody with the healthcare that they need. And that's got to be part of the programme that we fight for.
So what else does the Cath review recommend?
Well, good point. The Cath review has got a lot of questions in it, but I would say not masses of answers. For example, I think I mentioned it earlier, it notes the disproportionate increase in the number of young people presenting at gender clinics who were registered female at birth, and the review admits that there is very limited understanding of why this is the case. It gives the statistic of 3,499 patients who'd been discharged between 1st of April 2018 and the 31st of December 2022. 73% of them were birth registered female and 27 were birth registered male. And the reason I would say that poses a challenge to the review, but also really it's like what we were saying earlier, to the established understanding of trans identity, is because it contradicts the framework of capitalist anti-trans attacks. That they have identified trans women as a section of society that they can whip up fear and distrust and hatred around, and trans men are barely mentioned. And that's because they want to use it to make an appeal to fear about, like we were saying, refuges, safe spaces, and so on.
So it's a very complicated situation, and we are getting into Pride season in 2025. What is our approach to this?
Well, I mean, we've always said it, but I would say it's more true than ever that prides need to be protests. They need to be places where workers and young people can access and discuss ideas for the fight back. The obstacle to that, I would say, are the existing self-imposed leaders of the LGBT movement who, from everything that I think you can see, appear to be lost in this new scenario, who had accepted the idea that LGBTQ plus liberation was an inevitability. And that partly came from the fact that we've been through a period of legal rights being won, changing the age of consent, equal marriage, gender recognition, some of them under the Tories or New Labour governments as well. But, like I said, that idea that we could just rely on the courts to incrementally just give us a bit more and a bit more and a bit more until we finally get there, I think the Supreme Court ruling has really smashed that idea. And, they believed that hype, and that basically has been blown out of the water now. That's why, they shouldn't have cancelled Liverpool Pride, I don't think. We don't need, it's nice to have a great pride, isn't it? But we do not need floats, to make our events great. What we need for that is solidarity, actually, isn't it? Is an invite to everybody who is in defence of LGBTQ plus rights, against austerity, against privatisation, against everything that the capitalist crisis means for our lives, to come out together in a massive protest. We don't need balloons to make a splash. We need demands and a programme that can appeal to all those different sections of society to show that we are in a collective struggle, yes, for LGBTQ plus liberation, but for an end to austerity, an end to war, and for a socialist alternative. And I also would add to that, because we've seen it in Brighton, Bristol, Oxford, various prides, a ban on political parties. Now, you can understand that some people might go, yeah, Labour have got no place in our prides, the Tories have got no place in our prides. But I would say, actually, Labour's probably going, oh yes, we'll definitely obey that ban, because that means that they don't have to come and face the anger of workers and young people on those prides. It lets them off the hook. That's it doesn't do what we need it to do, really, I would say.
So how do we challenge Labour?
Well, I would say the best way to challenge Labour is to have an alternative. At the moment, Reform is benefiting from that. We saw that in the local elections. But we need a new mass workers' party to challenge Labour from the left that could represent all of our interests. And I think that would be a brilliant way of bringing the struggle, all our struggles together. The Socialist Party is really fighting for that. In fact, we have been for a whole period of time, but I think we're finding it now, aren't we, in the union conferences, when we're campaigning on the streets at prides and so on. We're finding a real openness to that, because people have been waiting so long for a Labour government, and so quickly they have shown that they are just going to carry on with all of the Tory austerity, but also the Tory division. So that idea of building a new mass workers' party is really getting an echo. And we would say as well that our role, in the struggle for it, and when we have new formation being built, will be to fight for that new party to have a really clear socialist program as well that can, cut across all of these attempts to divide us, and cut across those ideas that different sections of the working class are in some way pitted against each other within the limits of capitalism.
But it's a pretty bleak picture at the moment, isn't it?
Well, it is. I mean, it is. It's horrible. I mean, there's so many things that are being lost, actually. It's a bad situation in that way. But I think we should also have confidence because we are facing attacks. The whole of the world's working class is facing attacks because all of the governments are attempting to rule in the interests of capitalism. So they're compelled to attack us. But we should have confidence that there is widespread revulsion and hatred of those capitalist leaders. We can see the increasing, how long has Trump been in power now? 4 or 5 months or something? And there's some of the biggest protests that have taken place, the No Kings, the big rallies against the oligarchs, people who claim to be socialists winning elections and so on. There's big opposition developing. And yes, there is a polarization. There is division being whipped up. But I'd say there's also limits to that whipping up of division. I think one of the things that we have to keep on reminding people is that the Tories went all in on anti-trans division in the run-up to the general election. I mean, that was their big card, wasn't it? And what happened to them? They were absolutely smashed because they had no alternative to, more cost of living crisis. It couldn't save them. So I think that's a limit. And yes, as a result of that, that whipping up of fear, of distrust and so on, there has been a slight drop in support for trans rights, but it remains a majority. I mean, and that is really significant, I think. We've got to fight to, increase it massively, and that will be done through the way that the trade unions, that we fight for the trade unions to take up the Supreme Court ruling in the workplace to challenge the idea of what the division represents. But, let's put it a little bit historically. In 2023, the British Social Attitude Survey found that 67% of people think a sexual relationship between two people of the same sex is never wrong. In 1983, that was 17%. So historically, we're really at a high level, and we should be confident that that gives us the basis to go out and organise and to demand the, uniting of all of our struggles. Trump, like we were saying about the US, those protests are a reflection, even at this early stage, that Trump is completely unable to solve the problems that working class people face of low pay, high prices, and his tariffs are not going to solve that. Neither will closing down suicide helplines, and that will become clearer as the situation develops. It will be particularly clearer if there was the development of a political voice for all of those who oppose him. And actually, there is, we can see a bit of division at the top in the administration, at the top of US society amongst the capitalist class. And one of the biggest fears that some of those more far-sighted elements of that class have is that Trump is going to continue to whip up opposition, not just to his measures, but to their system. And actually, we've got to do everything that we can to encourage that. So, the young socialists who are organising walkouts here in Britain against Trump's visit, in solidarity with those youth and LGBTQ plus people and workers in the US, that's really important. And I'm sure you'll share the links to all of that in the notes. Because it's in struggle that the huge potential for solidarity really, comes into play, so that can cut across division. We don't have time to go into it now, but we saw it in the miners' strike. That figure of 17% in 1983, that was just before the miners' strike. But nonetheless, at that time, deeply held prejudices in some of those mining towns and villages, they were cut across by solidarity being organised with their strike between the different sections, between black workers, between LGBTQ plus workers, different sections of the working class, recognising that they had a common cause in fighting Thatcher, who was trying to attack them all. And we're going to see that, I think, on an even greater scale today. So I would say we're confident in the Socialist Party, despite all of these things happening. And we're clear on our job, actually, is to put forward the concrete ideas of what can be done, how it can be fought, and that we've got to fight for every improvement that we can in every part of life. That means defending libraries, defending access to toilets. It means defending the right to self-identify of trans and non-binary people. It means standing with bin workers and on picket lines against the Birmingham Labour Council that is trying to cut their pay and their jobs and so on. But in all of that, we've got to point to what is needed, and that is the maximum unity that can be fought for by coming together in a new party, in the trade unions, in struggle, and that a programme that shows how all of our needs can be met within the struggle for socialism is really, really important, because that basically means taking the wealth off the 1%, planning society democratically by the working class to meet all of our needs, starting with nationalisation of the banks and the corporations, the biggest ones that dominate the economy, and instead using society's wealth like that to provide the health services that we need, fund our schools, etc., etc. And we believe as well that the fight for a socialist world is the fight for a world where prejudice, bigotry, discrimination are all, become history, basically, and that everyone can just be themselves then. And I, really think that is something worth fighting for, but I also think it's something that we definitely can fight for.
Nice. Well, thanks for joining me today, Sarah.
Thank you, Oscar.
See you next time.
See you.
If you're not yet a member of the Socialist Party and agree with the points raised today, then get in touch on our website, www.socialistparty.org.uk, to find out what being a member will mean for you. Our website's packed with more political analysis, and you can subscribe to our weekly paper, The Socialist, and our monthly magazine, Socialism Today, getting them delivered to your door or an e-subscription to your email. The Socialist Party has no big business backers. All of our work is funded by donations from individual supporters. And if you agree that we need an alternative to war, capitalism, and endless cuts for the poor, make a donation today.